I was 31 the afternoon my mother told me calmly that my name had never really belonged on anything important. She didn't say it cruelly. That's what made it worse. We were standing in the narrow kitchen of my childhood home in Asheville, North Carolina, sunlight slanting through the window like it always had. She was wiping the counter with slow, circular motions, the way she did when she wanted to sound reasonable. "It just made more sense this way," she said. "You understand." I didn't, not yet. We were there to talk about my grandmother's house, the one on Laurel Ridge. The white two-story with the wraparound porch, the place where I spent every summer from the time I was 5 until college. I had assumed quietly that the house would be sold someday, and the proceeds divided. I had never asked. In my family, asking was considered tacky. Trust was the currency. My older brother Marcus leaned against the fridge, scrolling his phone, half listening. His wife Elaine sat at the table, legs crossed, posture perfect, already acting like this conversation was an inconvenience she'd moved past. My mother cleared her throat. "The deed was transferred last year." I blinked. "Transferred to who?" She finally looked at me. "Marcus." The room didn't go silent. The refrigerator hummed. A car passed outside, but something inside me thinned out like air escaping a balloon. When I asked, "Last fall," she said, "after your grandmother's health declined." My grandmother had passed in the spring. No one had mentioned paperwork. No one had mentioned urgency. "You didn't tell me," I said. My mother shrugged. "You were busy, and honestly, you don't need a house." There it was, the sentence that landed harder than the decision itself. "You don't need." I had heard versions of it my whole life. "You don't need help. You don't need attention. You don't need security. You're strong, independent, capable." In my family, those words were never compliments. They were explanations for why I got less. "I helped pay for the roof," I said quietly, 3 years ago, when the storm hit. "That was generous of you," she replied, still calm. "But generosity doesn't mean ownership." Marcus looked up then. "Let's not do this," he said. Mom made a decision. I stared at him. At the man who had borrowed money from me twice in the last 5 years and never once mentioned the house. "So I don't even get a conversation," I said. My mother set the cloth down and folded her hands. "You always make things complicated." That was when something shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for me to feel it in my chest. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a system. I left soon after. No shouting, no tears. I hugged my mother out of habit and drove back to my apartment feeling strangely detached, like I'd watched something happen to someone else. That night, I lay awake, replaying small moments. My grandmother's birthday cards. The way she used to say, "Make sure you're taken care of." The time she asked me if I trusted my mother with paperwork. I had laughed then. The next morning, my brother texted, "Don't take this personally, you know how Mom is." I didn't reply. Instead, I did something I had never done before. I opened a folder on my laptop and started collecting documents. Bank transfers, emails, the invoice from the contractor who fixed the roof, my grandmother's handwritten notes tucked into old birthday cards I had never thrown away. I wasn't angry yet. I was curious. Because once you realize love has been used as leverage, you start wondering what else has been quietly rearranged without your consent. By the end of the week, I had scheduled a consultation with an estate attorney in downtown Asheville. Her name was Ruth Adler. She spoke slowly and listened without interrupting. "Do you believe your grandmother intended to exclude you?" she asked. I thought about it. About summers on the porch, about her squeezing my hand before surgeries, about her saying, "I trust you." "No," I said. Ruth nodded. "Then the question isn't why they did this, it's how." I walked out of her office with a list of steps and a feeling I couldn't quite name yet. Not revenge, not grief, something colder. Clarity. At dinner that night alone, I realized something else. No one had apologized. No one had checked on me. No one had asked if I was okay. They had already decided I would absorb this the way I always had. And for the first time in my life, I knew I wasn't going to. The first thing that disappeared was my place at the table. Not literally. No one told me not to come over. No invitations were revoked. But the tone shifted in ways that didn't need explanation. Messages became shorter. Plans were made without looping me in. Conversations that used to pause when I entered now simply continued as if I were background noise. I noticed it at my mother's birthday dinner. She had insisted we keep it small. "Just family," she said. When I arrived, Marcus and Elaine were already there, seated comfortably, wine poured. There was an empty chair, but it wasn't next to my mother anymore. It was at the far end near the kitchen door. I sat there without comment. The evening moved on as if nothing had changed. They talked about renovations to the Laurel Ridge house, new railings for the porch, fresh paint for the shutters. Elaine described color samples with the authority of someone who already owned the place in her mind. No one asked my opinion. At one point, my mother said your grandmother would have loved seeing it refreshed. I swallowed. She always said the porch didn't need fixing. My mother smiled tightly. Times change. So did stories, apparently. When I left, she hugged me again. This time it felt rehearsed. On the drive home, my phone buzzed. A text from Elaine. I hope you're okay. This has been hard on Marcus, too. I stared at it, feeling something sour rise in my throat. Hard on him. The man who now held the deed. The man who hadn't mentioned it once while borrowing money from me to cover a credit card bill 6 months earlier. I typed a response, deleted it, typed another, deleted that too. Silence. I was learning was the only language they didn't know how to rewrite. The next escalation came disguised as concern. My mother called one afternoon while I was at work. I didn't answer. She left a voicemail. I've been worried about you, she said. You've seemed distant. I just want to make sure you're not spiraling over this. Spiraling. That word landed like a diagnosis. As if my reaction to being excluded from a major family decision was evidence of instability rather than awareness. She followed it with a text. You know we love you. Don't let this turn you bitter. There it was again. Love offered with a condition. Acceptance contingent on silence. That evening I forwarded the voicemail to Ruth. Her response came the next morning. This is common. Once assets are questioned, the narrative often shifts to the challenger's emotional state. I read that sentence 3 times. So what do? I asked when we spoke later that week. You document, she said. And you don't engage emotionally. Let the facts do the talking. Facts. They were harder to manipulate. Over the next 2 weeks, more things surfaced. A neighbor of my grandmother's mentioned casually that my mother had been meeting with a lawyer months before my grandmother died. A distant cousin let slip that Marcus had been handling paperwork early. Each piece landed quietly, fitting into a picture that was forming whether I wanted it to or not. This hadn't been rushed. It had been planned. One night I pulled out a box I hadn't opened in years. Letters, cards, old documents my grandmother had insisted I keep. At the bottom, folded carefully, was a note in her handwriting. If anything ever feels wrong, ask questions. Don't let them tell you you're difficult. My hands shook as I held it. The next morning, Ruth filed a formal request for documentation related to the deed transfer. That was when the temperature changed. Marcus called me for the first time since the kitchen conversation. What are you doing? He asked, skipping any pretense. I'm asking questions, I said. You're making this into a legal mess, he snapped. Mom's beside herself. I pictured my mother's calm voice, her controlled expressions. Beside herself didn't match the image. Did Grandma know I asked? He hesitated, just long enough. She trusted Mom, he said. So did I replied. That doesn't mean, it means everything I cut in. My voice surprised even me. Not loud, just firm. He exhaled sharply. You're going to tear this family apart. I let that sit. No, I said finally. I am just not holding it together alone anymore. He hung up without saying goodbye. That night, my mother sent a long email. Pages of justification, fear, sacrifice, how hard it had been managing everything, how she had done what she thought was best. She never mentioned my grandmother's wishes. She never mentioned my contributions. She ended with, I raised you better than this. I didn't respond. Instead, I asked Ruth to move forward. The formal notice went out the following Monday. By Wednesday, my mother had retained her own attorney. By Friday, the family group chat went quiet. No more photos, no updates, no passive-aggressive holiday planning. I wasn't removed. I was erased. And oddly, the quiet felt lighter than the noise ever had. For the first time, I could hear my own thoughts without her voice correcting them. I began to understand something essential. The betrayal wasn't just about the house. It was about being stripped of choice, then told it was love. About being expected to accept less and call it generosity. About watching people you trusted close ranks the moment you stopped being convenient. This wasn't grief. This was awakening. And it was only just beginning. The silence didn't mean peace, it meant strategy. I realized that a few days after the group chat went quiet. No messages didn't mean no conversations were happening. It just meant they weren't happening where I could see them anymore. My mother stopped calling. Marcus didn't text. Elaine disappeared entirely. If I hadn't known better, I might have thought they were giving me space out of respect. They weren't. They were regrouping. The first hint came from an unexpected place. A woman from my grandmother's church, someone I barely knew beyond polite greetings at Christmas services, stopped me outside a grocery store. "I heard you're having a hard time," she said gently. I looked at her confused. "Am I?" She hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "Your mother said you've been very upset since everything happened. That you're struggling." Struggling. Another word added to the growing list of labels being attached to me. Emotional, bitter, spiraling, now struggling. I smiled politely. "I'm actually doing fine." She nodded unconvinced and wished me well before walking away. I sat in my car afterward with the engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel, feeling something cold settle behind my ribs. This was familiar terrain, the quiet character assassination that let everyone feel compassionate while dismissing the substance of what I was saying. By the time I got home, I had 3 new messages, all from relatives I rarely spoke to, all vague, all carefully neutral. "Checking in, hope you're okay. Families can be complicated." No one asked what had happened. No one asked for details. They didn't want truth. They wanted reassurance that siding with my mother wouldn't make them complicit in anything ugly. I didn't reply. That afternoon, Ruth called. "They're pushing back," she said. "How?" I asked. "Your mother's attorney claims your grandmother intended to reward Marcus for taking care of her affairs," Ruth replied. "They're framing it as compensation." I laughed softly. Marcus lived 2 hours away. I was the one driving her to appointments. "I know," Ruth said. "But intent is easy to claim when the person who could clarify it is gone." The reality of that landed heavier than anything else so far. My grandmother wasn't here to correct the story. She couldn't speak for herself. And the people who claimed to love her most were rewriting her decisions without hesitation. "Do they have proof?" I asked. "Not yet," Ruth said. "But that doesn't mean they won't try to manufacture a narrative." That word again, narrative. It was becoming clear that this wasn't just about money or property. It was about control over the story. Who was generous? Who was greedy? Who was stable? Who was ungrateful? And I was being cast in a role I hadn't agreed to play. 2 days later, Marcus showed up at my apartment. No warning, no text, just a knock at my door in the early evening. I didn't open it at first. I watched through the peephole as he shifted his weight, checked his phone, knocked again. When I finally opened the door, he looked surprised, like he hadn't expected me to answer. "You look fine," he said. "I am," I replied. He stepped inside without asking, glancing around my apartment as if taking inventory. It was small but tidy. Nothing extravagant, nothing that suggested desperation. "Mom's really worried," he began. I leaned against the counter and waited. "She thinks you're letting this get out of hand," he continued. "That lawyers are poisoning your perspective." I almost smiled. "Funny. She hired one first." He ignored that. "You know she didn't mean to hurt you." "I know she didn't mean to consult me," I said. "Those are different things." He ran a hand through his hair. "Why are you doing this?" I looked at him. Really looked. At the man who had always been buffered from consequences, who had never had to explain himself, who had been trusted by default. Because I was excluded, I said simply, "That's not true," he said quickly. "You just didn't need the house." There it was again, the justification, the phrase that erased me so neatly. "Need has nothing to do with it," I replied. "Neither does entitlement. It's about consent." He frowned. "Consent to what?" "To decisions that affect me," I said. "To being erased from something my grandmother built for both of us." He crossed his arms. "You're making this sound sinister." "Because it is," I said. "You just didn't notice when it benefited you." His jaw tightened. "You're accusing us of manipulation." I didn't answer right away. "I'm saying the truth only started to matter when it stopped working in your favor," I said. He stared at me, then laughed sharply. "You always had a flair for drama." That did it. Not because it was cruel, because it was dismissive, because it reduced everything I was standing on to temperament. "You should go," I said. "What?" "You should leave," I repeated, calm, certain. He hesitated. "You're really going to do this?" I nodded. "I already am." He left without another word. That night I couldn't sleep, not from anxiety, from awareness. I replayed years of small moments, the way my mother spoke for me, the way Marcus assumed agreement, the way silence had been mistaken for consent over and over again. I saw the pattern clearly now. Love in my family had always been conditional. Approval was earned by compliance. Security was offered only to those who didn't ask questions. I had asked one, and everything had started to unravel. The next morning, Ruth emailed me an update. She had requested a copy of my grandmother's will. It had been amended 6 months before her death. My name wasn't on the property section anymore. I stared at the screen for a long time, not shocked, just steady, because now I knew something important. This hadn't been an oversight. It had been a choice, and choices once exposed could be challenged. I closed my laptop, made coffee, and sat at my kitchen table watching the sun come up. The house on Laurel Ridge wasn't just a house anymore. It was proof of how quietly people could rewrite your place in their lives when they believed you wouldn't push back. They were wrong. And soon they were going to understand exactly how wrong. The amended will arrived in a plain envelope, the kind designed not to draw attention to itself. I opened it at my kitchen table with the same care I used for everything now. Slowly, deliberately, no rushing, no assumptions. I had learned that speed was how people like my mother slipped decisions past you. The document was clean, professionally drafted, clear. 6 months before my grandmother died, the house on Laurel Ridge had been reassigned entirely to Marcus. No mention of me, no contingency, no explanation. Oh, I read it twice, then a third time. It didn't hurt the way I expected it to. Not like a fresh wound. It felt older than that. Like a bruise I hadn't realized was there until someone pressed on it. Ruth called later that afternoon. "This doesn't end the conversation," she said carefully, "but it explains their confidence. So she changed it," I said. "And no one thought I should know." Ruth paused. "The timing matters." "How so?" "Your grandmother was already declining," she said. "And you were helping manage her appointments at that point." I closed my eyes. I remembered those months clearly. Driving her to the clinic, sitting beside her while she slept in the passenger seat, the way she squeezed my hand when paperwork came out, trusting me to read the fine print. "She asked for me," I said quietly. "I know," Ruth replied. "That's why we don't stop here." The next step was uncomfortable even for me. We requested medical records. Not to pry, to establish capacity. When my mother received notice of that request, the call finally came. She didn't waste time on greetings. "How dare you?" she said, her voice sharp with a kind of anger I had never heard directed at me before. "Questioning your grandmother's mind. That's disgusting." I held the phone away from my ear for a second, then brought it back. "This isn't about her mind," I said calmly. "It's about timing. You're turning her death into a courtroom spectacle," she snapped. "No," I said. "You did that when you decided silence was easier than honesty." She inhaled sharply. "You always think you're smarter than everyone else." I almost laughed. "No," I replied. "I think I was quieter." There was a beat of silence. "You're doing this because you're jealous," she said finally. "Marcus stayed. He showed up. You left. I moved 20 minutes away," I said. "I came every weekend." "That's not the same," she shot back. "Because it didn't make me dependent," I said. She went quiet. I waited. "This is tearing the family apart," she said softer now. "People are talking." I pictured the grocery store woman, the concerned looks, the whispers that had already begun. "They were always going to talk," I said. "The only difference is that now they don't control the version." She ended the call abruptly. The following week, Marcus emailed me. Not called, emailed. "This has gone too far. Mom is devastated. We can still fix this if you drop the legal action." I read it twice, then forwarded it to Ruth. Her response came quickly. "They're afraid of discovery." That word again. Discovery. The phase where stories stopped being enough. The medical records arrived 2 weeks later. My grandmother had been diagnosed with early cognitive decline before the will was amended. Not severe, not incapacitating, but documented, enough to raise questions about undue influence. Ruth didn't celebrate. She never did. "This strengthens your position," she said, "but it also raises the stakes." How, I asked. "Because now they have something to lose," she replied. "And people in that position don't back down quietly." She was right. The pressure escalated fast. My aunt stopped speaking to me entirely. A cousin sent a message accusing me of disrespecting my grandmother's memory. Someone from church mailed me a handwritten letter urging forgiveness. Forgiveness, I learned, was the word people used when they wanted you to stop making them uncomfortable. No one asked if I felt betrayed. No one asked why I had been excluded. They just wanted the noise to stop. One evening, Elaine called. Her voice was measured, controlled. The tone of someone who believed she could reason her way out of anything. "You're hurting Marcus," she said. I leaned back in my chair. "Marcus is an adult." "You're threatening our stability," she continued. "The house is our future." "So was my grandmother's trust," I replied. She sighed. "You never cared about the house." "That's not true," I said. "I cared enough not to weaponize it." She paused. "What do you want?" The question landed differently coming from her. "I want transparency," I said. "And I want what was taken without consent addressed." "That could destroy your relationship with your mother," she warned. I smiled, though she couldn't see it. You're assuming I still have one. She didn't respond. After we hung up, I sat in the quiet and felt something settle inside me. For the first time, I wasn't bracing for fallout. I was watching it happen from a distance. I had crossed an invisible line, the one where you stop trying to be understood by people invested in misunderstanding you. Ruth filed the formal challenge shortly after. It wasn't dramatic. Just pages of filings supported by timelines records and the absence of one crucial thing: my consent. The notice went out on a Friday. By Monday morning, my mother's attorney requested a meeting. Not mediation, not reconciliation. A meeting. Ruth looked at me over her glasses. This is where things change. How so? They're no longer pretending this is a misunderstanding, she said. They're preparing to defend a decision. I nodded. That night alone in my apartment, I thought about the girl I had been. The one who believed love meant flexibility, who believed keeping the peace was a virtue, who believed silence was maturity. I understood now how easily that version of me had been used. Not maliciously, maybe, but efficiently. The amended will wasn't just a document, it was a mirror. And I finally saw who I had been expected to be. Someone who didn't look too closely. Someone who didn't ask follow-up questions. Someone who accepted erasure as kindness. That version of me was gone. And the people who relied on her were about to feel the difference. The meeting took place on a gray Thursday morning in a conference room that smelled faintly of coffee and printer toner. Neutral ground. That was the idea. My mother arrived first. She sat stiffly at the far end of the table, hands folded, eyes fixed on a point just above my shoulder. Marcus and Elaine came in together a few minutes later. They didn't sit next to me. They didn't sit next to her either. They chose the middle as if geography could soften allegiance. Ruth and I arrived last. No one stood. No one smiled. The attorney my mother had hired was younger than I expected. Crisp suit, controlled voice. Someone who knew how to make complicated things sound reasonable. He opened by thanking everyone for coming, then spoke for several minutes about grief, family history, and the importance of resolution. I listened without reacting. When he finished, Ruth leaned forward. "We're not here to resolve feelings," she said evenly. "We're here to address process." The room went still. My mother's attorney nodded. "Of course, but context matters." "Only if it's documented," Ruth replied. I watched my mother's jaw tighten. Then the attorney turned to me. "You understand that your grandmother made changes of her own free will," he said. "This challenge could imply otherwise." I met his gaze. "I understand that I was never informed." "That doesn't mean you were entitled," Elaine interjected quickly. Ruth raised a hand. "Let's keep this orderly." The attorney slid a folder across the table. "Our position," he said, "is that the property transfer reflected your grandmother's wishes and that your mother acted appropriately in facilitating them." "And the timing?" Ruth asked. He hesitated. "Just a fraction." "Timing alone doesn't indicate undue influence," he said. "No," Ruth agreed. "But timing plus cognitive decline plus exclusion does." My mother spoke then, her voice tight but controlled. "I did what I thought was best," she said. "I knew Marcus would take care of the house. I knew you didn't want the responsibility." She finally looked at me. "You always said you didn't want to be tied down." I blinked slowly. "I said I didn't want to live there," I replied. "Not that I didn't want to be considered." She frowned. "That's splitting hairs." "No," I said, "that's splitting power." Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "I never asked for this," he said. I turned to him. "You accepted it." He looked away. Ruth spoke again. "We've reviewed the medical records, we've reviewed the financial contributions, and we've reviewed the communications. There is a pattern of unilateral decision-making here that excluded my client." My mother scoffed. "So now I'm the villain." "No," Ruth said calmly. "You're the decision-maker. That carries responsibility." The attorney leaned back. "What is it you want?" he asked me directly. The question hung there. Not what would fix this. Not what would make things right. "What do you want?" I had thought about that question more than anything else over the past month. "I want the transfer invalidated," I said. "And I want the property held in trust until a fair resolution is reached." Elaine inhaled sharply. "That's outrageous." "Why?" I asked. "Because it destabilizes everything," she said. "We've already made plans. Plans, renovations, furniture, futures built on something that had never been fully theirs. That's not my responsibility," I said. My mother shook her head. "You're punishing us." "No," I replied. "I'm correcting an imbalance." Marcus finally looked at me. "You could have just talked to us." "I tried," I said. "You told me not to make things complicated." Silence settled over the room. The attorney cleared his throat. "Given the information presented, we're willing to discuss a settlement." Ruth didn't respond immediately. "What kind?" she asked. A financial arrangement, he said. Compensation in lieu of property interest. I felt a flicker of anger then. Not loud, not explosive, just sharp. So the solution is to buy me out, I said, of something I was never allowed into. It's practical, Elaine said quickly. It's convenient, I corrected. Ruth spoke before I could say more. We'll consider it, but understand this. My client is not here to be pacified. She's here to be acknowledged. The meeting ended without agreement. As we stood to leave, my mother reached for my arm. Look at what you're doing, she said quietly. You're forcing us into corners. I met her eyes. You lived there for years. She let go. In the hallway, Marcus followed me. I don't recognize you, he said. I stopped walking. I don't recognize the version of you who thought this was okay, I replied. He opened his mouth, then closed it. That night back home, I sat in the dark and replayed the meeting. What struck me most wasn't the defensiveness, or the anger, or even the entitlement. It was the assumption. The assumption that I would eventually fold. That pressure, isolation, and appeals to family would wear me down. That I would choose peace over dignity like I always had. They hadn't prepared for what happened when I didn't. The following week, Ruth initiated discovery. Requests went out for emails, drafts of the amended will, communications between my mother and the lawyer who prepared it, records of meetings, notes. The machinery began to turn, and with it, the tone changed again. My mother called late one night. Her voice was low, exhausted. I never meant for you to feel like this, she said. I closed my eyes. Then why didn't you tell me? She didn't answer. You decided what I could handle, I continued. And you were wrong. She exhaled shakily. If this goes to court, it will ruin everything. I thought about the porch on Laurel Ridge, about my grandmother's hands on mine, about the years of being told I didn't need. It already did, I said. You just didn't notice when it wasn't happening to you. She hung up without saying goodbye. The next morning, Ruth called. They're scrambling, she said. We're getting partial disclosures. What does that mean? It means they're afraid of what we'll find, she replied. I sat at my desk, coffee untouched, heart steady. For the first time since this began, I felt something close to power. Not because I was winning, but because I was no longer reacting. I was setting the pace. The small, quiet choice I had made in my mother's kitchen weeks ago had grown into something they could no longer contain. And as the legal process pulled more truth into the light, one thing became increasingly clear. This was never just about a house. It was about who had been allowed to decide, and who had been expected to live with it. Discovery does not arrive all at once. It drips. At first, it was emails, long chains forwarded without context, dates out of order, attachments missing. Then drafts of the amended will marked up with comments in my mother's handwriting. Questions, suggestions, revisions that didn't come from my grandmother. Ruth spread the documents across her desk and said nothing for a long time. This tells a story, she finally said. What kind, I asked. One that wasn't meant to be read from the beginning, she replied. The emails showed my mother initiating contact with the attorney months before my grandmother's diagnosis was disclosed to the family. They showed concern about timing, about efficiency, about making sure things were settled before winter. They showed Marcus copied on messages that referenced me only indirectly. Your daughter. The other one. She lives nearby. No one asked if I should be present. No one suggested transparency. The most damning message was short. She won't make a fuss. She never does. Ruth didn't have to explain why that mattered. The second wave of discovery was financial. Bank statements, checks, transfers related to the house, payments for repairs I had contributed to without knowing the property had already been earmarked for someone else. I stared at the numbers, not because of their size, but because of the pattern. Money moved freely when it flowed toward what my mother wanted protected. My role in that system had been simple. Support without visibility. Contribution without voice. That payment, Ruth said, pointing to a line item from 3 years earlier, happened after the first meeting with the attorney. I felt something settle in my chest. So she already knew, I said, and still let me help. Yes, Ruth replied. There it was. Not misunderstanding, not oversight, not confusion. Choice. The third wave came from a place none of us had anticipated. A former paralegal from the firm that handled the will reached out. Quietly, through her own attorney. She had left the firm months earlier and was uncomfortable with how the amendment had been processed. She remembers your grandmother, Ruth explained, and she remembers the meeting. My stomach tightened. What about it? She remembers your mother doing most of the talking. The affidavit arrived 2 days later. Carefully worded, measured, but clear. My grandmother had asked if both grandchildren were being treated equally. The attorney had deferred to my mother. The conversation moved on. No correction followed. No clarification was offered. Consent in that room had been assumed. When Ruth read the affidavit aloud, I felt an unexpected wave of grief. Not for the house, not for the money. For the moment, my grandmother had tried quietly to ask the right question, and how easily it had been redirected. My mother's attorney requested a pause in discovery shortly after. Claimed burden, claimed stress, claimed diminishing returns. Ruth declined. The next call I received from my mother was different. She didn't accuse, she didn't justify. She pleaded. "I'm tired," she said. "This has gone on long enough." I sat on my couch phone pressed to my ear, listening to the sound of her breathing. "You could stop this," she continued. "You could choose peace." Peace. The word she always used when she wanted me to give something up. "I did choose peace," I said. "I chose mine." She was quiet for a moment. "You don't understand what you're doing to this family," she said. "I understand exactly," I replied. "I'm just no longer willing to absorb it." Her voice cracked. "After everything I've done for you." I thought about rides, meals, birthdays, the things that get counted when the balance sheet is emotional, not factual. "And everything you decided for me," I said. She hung up. The following week, Marcus was deposed. "He called me the night before." His voice sounded hollow. "I don't know what to say," he admitted. "You don't have to say anything specific," I told him. "You just have to tell the truth." He laughed softly. "That's the problem." When the transcript came back, it confirmed what I already knew. He hadn't orchestrated this, but he hadn't questioned it either. He testified that he trusted our mother to handle things, that he assumed she'd spoken to me, that he didn't think to follow up when she said it was taken care of. Assumption, the most powerful tool in our family. When asked if he knew about my financial contributions after the will was amended, he hesitated. "I didn't think it mattered," he said. It mattered. The pressure intensified after that. Relatives stopped being neutral. Lines were drawn quietly. Invitations disappeared. Conversations ended abruptly when I entered rooms. I became the problem they needed me to be, so no one else had to examine their own silence. I didn't fight it. I stopped attending events. I stopped explaining myself. I stopped translating my boundaries into something softer so others wouldn't feel accused. At work, I noticed something else shifting. I spoke more directly. I declined tasks that weren't mine. I stopped volunteering to clean up messes I hadn't made. No one punished me for it. In fact, people respected it. The contrast was stark. One afternoon, Ruth called with an update. "They're offering to reverse the amendment," she said. My heart skipped, then steadied. "Completely?" "Yes," she replied. "But they want it sealed, quiet, no admission." I closed my eyes. "No," I said. Ruth didn't argue. "Why?" she asked gently. "Because quiet is what got us here," I replied. "I'm not doing that again." There was a pause. "Then we proceed," she said. When I hung up, I felt something unfamiliar. Not anxiety, readiness. Discovery had stripped away every excuse, every alternate explanation, every story that depended on my silence. What remained was simple. I had been counted on not to resist. And now they were running out of ways to contain that fact. The question was no longer whether I would win. It was how much they were willing to lose to avoid admitting what they had done. The first real loss wasn't legal. It was social. I noticed it the week after Discovery refused to pause. The invitations that used to arrive casually without ceremony stopped altogether. Sunday lunches, birthday dinners, even the obligatory holiday planning emails went quiet. No announcement, no explanation, just absence. At first, I told myself it was temporary, that people didn't know what to say, that they were giving space, that once things settled, normal would resume. Then I overheard my name spoken carefully at a coffee shop. 2 women from my grandmother's church sat at the table behind me. I recognized their voices before I registered what they were saying. "She's taking it to court," one of them whispered. "Well," the other replied, "you never really know what's going on in someone's head." That sentence landed harder than any insult. Not greedy, not cruel, unstable. I paid my bill and left without turning around. By the time I got home, I understood something important. I wasn't being isolated by accident. I was being contained. When people can't discredit your facts, they question your temperament. When they can't argue the timeline, they imply emotional imbalance. It's quieter that way, more polite, more effective. My mother didn't call during that period. She didn't have to. Her version of the story was already circulating, carried by concern and pity instead of anger. Ruth warned me this would happen. Once truth threatens identity, she said, people protect the identity. That included relatives who had never asked me how I was doing. That included cousins who had borrowed money from me in the past. That included people who had watched my mother control rooms for decades and called it strength. The isolation wasn't loud. It was efficient. Marcus called one evening, his voice low. "They're saying you've changed," he said. "I have," I replied. "They're worried about you." I laughed softly. "That's convenient." He sighed. "Mom says you're letting bitterness drive this." "Bitterness doesn't file motions," I said. "Documentation does." He didn't respond. Then he said something that surprised me. "She's scared." I paused. "Of what?" "Of being exposed," he admitted. The honesty caught me off guard. "Then why defend her?" I asked. He was quiet for a long moment. "Because if she's wrong," he said slowly, "then a lot of things I accepted without question fall apart." There it was. The cost of clarity isn't just confrontation, it's collapse. Of narratives. Of identities built on unexamined loyalty. "I can't protect that for you," I said. "I know," he replied. After that call, I sat alone in my apartment, lights off, listening to the city hum outside my window. I didn't feel lonely. I felt untethered. For the first time, I wasn't orienting myself around anyone else's comfort. That was when the legal momentum shifted. Ruth called with urgency in her voice. "We have enough to request summary judgment on part of the claim," she said. "What part?" I asked. "Undue influence," she replied, "and failure to disclose material changes." My chest tightened. "What does that mean?" "It means a judge could rule without a full trial," she explained, "based on the evidence alone." Silence filled the line. "They didn't expect this," she added. No, they hadn't. They had expected exhaustion, isolation, pressure. They had expected me to retreat. Instead, I had simplified. I stopped explaining myself. I stopped attending spaces that treated my presence like disruption. I stopped reacting to rumors I couldn't control. And in that vacuum, something else grew. Authority. The hearing was scheduled for early spring. When my mother found out, she broke her silence. She showed up at my apartment unannounced, standing in the hallway like a woman waiting for a verdict. I didn't invite her in. "We need to talk," she said. "We've been talking," I replied. "Through lawyers." She shook her head. "That's not what I meant." I leaned against the door frame. "Then say what you mean." Her face crumpled just slightly. "You're humiliating me." I didn't flinch. "You hid decisions from me," I said. "That was humiliation. This is consequence." She stared at me like she didn't recognize the language. "You're choosing this over family," she said. "No," I replied. "I'm choosing myself after family chose for me." Her voice dropped. "If this goes through, people will never look at me the same." I thought about the women at the coffee shop, the whispered concerns, the quiet judgment already happening. "They already are," I said. She stepped closer. "I gave everything to my children." "You decided what counted as everything," I replied. We stood there for a long moment, two women connected by history, separated by reality. "You were always the easy one," she said softly. "You didn't need much." That sentence finally cracked something. "I needed honesty," I said. "You just never offered it." She left without another word. The night before the hearing, I slept deeply. No rehearsed arguments, no spiraling thoughts. Just rest. Because by then, the outcome mattered less than the fact that I had stopped cooperating with my own erasure. The hearing itself was brief. Ruth spoke. The judge asked questions. The evidence was reviewed. And then the judge ruled that the amendment to the will required further scrutiny under undue influence standards. The case would proceed. My mother's attorney looked stunned. Ruth looked satisfied. I felt something else entirely. Relief. Not because I was winning, but because the system had finally acknowledged what my family never had. That my consent mattered. That silence was an agreement. That being the quiet one didn't make me invisible. When I walked out of the courthouse, the air felt sharper, cleaner. Spring was coming. And for the first time, I wasn't bracing for what my family might take next. I was deciding what I would keep. After the hearing, something subtle but irreversible happened. The fear shifted. Up until then, the tension had lived mostly in my body, in the way my shoulders stayed tight, in how I checked my phone too often, in the way I measured every silence for meaning. But once the judge ruled that the amendment required scrutiny, the fear moved. It was no longer mine to carry alone. It belonged to them now. I noticed it first in the tone of the emails, shorter, less confident, words chosen carefully as if anything careless might be used later, because now it could be. Ruth called me the afternoon after the ruling. "They're asking about settlement again," she said. "Different terms?" I asked. "Yes," she replied. "They're willing to unwind the amendment completely and restore the prior version of the will." I closed my eyes, and I asked, "And they want you to sign a non-disclosure agreement," Ruth continued. "No admission of wrongdoing, no discussion outside the family." There it was. The price of restoration was silence. I pictured my grandmother's note. Don't let them tell you you're difficult. I pictured the grocery store whispers, the concerned looks, the careful isolation. No, I said. Ruth didn't argue. She never did when I was certain. Then we move forward, she said. The next escalation came from a place I hadn't expected. My workplace. I was called into a meeting with Human Resources late one afternoon. The request was neutral, professional, no urgency. Still, my stomach tightened. The representative spoke gently, hands folded on the table. We received a call expressing concern about your well-being, she said. I didn't ask who it was from, I already knew. She said what I asked calmly. That you're under significant family stress, the representative replied, and that she was worried it might affect your work. I felt something cold settle behind my ribs. My performance reviews are current, I said, and strong. Yes, she agreed quickly. This is not disciplinary. We just wanted to check in. I nodded. I appreciate that. After the meeting, I sat in my car for a long time without turning the key. This was new territory. Not emotional pressure, not social pressure. Professional. It was the first time my mother had reached beyond family to reassert control, to frame me as unstable rather than wronged. I called Ruth as soon as I got home. She crossed a line, Ruth said without hesitation, and she knows it. What do we do? I asked. We document, she replied, and we respond proportionally. That night, I drafted an email with Ruth's guidance. Clear, factual, non-emotional. I stated that any further attempts to interfere with my employment would be addressed through formal channels. It felt strange drawing that boundary in writing, but it also felt clean. The response came the next day, from my mother's attorney. Apologetic, regretful. They assured me no further contact would be made. She didn't apologize herself. She didn't need to. The silence said enough. At the same time, something else began to shift. People started reaching out quietly, not publicly, not in group settings, one by one. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in years messaged me late one night. I didn't know what to say back then. I'm sorry. A former neighbor of my grandmother's sent a note. Your grandmother loved you very much. She talked about you often. Even Elaine surprised me. She called unexpectedly and didn't start with accusation. I didn't know everything she said. I should have asked more questions. I didn't absolve her. I didn't need to. I know, I said, and I meant it. Not forgiveness, understanding. That was enough. The closer the case moved toward trial, the quieter my family became. The public narrative stalled. The whispers slowed. Silence returned, but this time it felt different. Less like erasure, more like retreat. Ruth prepared me for what came next. They're likely to settle before this reaches a jury, she said. Not because they agree with you, but because they don't want testimony. From who, I asked. She smiled slightly. From everyone. Depositions had already done damage. A trial would do more. Not financially, reputationally. My mother understood power. She always had. And she was losing control of the story. 2 weeks before trial, the offer changed again. No non-disclosure agreement. Full restoration of the original will. Formal acknowledgement that the amendment would be voided due to process concerns. Quiet, but accurate. I sat with the proposal for a long time. Not because I was unsure. Because I was grieving something I hadn't admitted yet. The fantasy that my mother would one day say I was wrong. That she would choose honesty over image. That she would see me. That fantasy was finally gone. And oddly, that made the decision easier. I accepted. Not as surrender. As conclusion. The paperwork was signed the following Friday. Ruth shook my hand. You did this the hard way, she said. There wasn't another way, I replied. When the settlement was finalized, my mother did not call. Marcus sent a single text. I hope this gives you peace. I stared at it, then typed back. It gives me agency. He didn't respond. That evening, I drove up to Laurel Ridge alone. The house looked the same. White siding, wide porch, the familiar creak of the steps. But it felt different now. Not because I owned part of it on paper, because it no longer owned me. I stood on the porch as the sun went down and thought about everything that had led me here. The silence, the assumptions, the quiet bargains I had never agreed to. This wasn't revenge. Revenge would have been loud. This was reclamation. I left before dark, locking the door behind me. Not because I had to, because I chose to. And for the first time in my life, that choice belonged entirely to me. The settlement didn't end anything. It clarified it. Once the papers were signed and the amended will was voided, the legal process slowed to a crawl and then stopped entirely. No hearings, no filings, no deadlines hovering over my calendar like weather warnings. just the quiet aftermath of something that had been building for years and finally broke its own surface. I expected relief to come crashing in all at once. It didn't. What came instead was space. Wide, unfamiliar space where obligation used to live. The first week after the settlement, I noticed how often my hand reached for my phone for no reason. Not to call anyone, not to check messages, just the reflex of monitoring, waiting, anticipating the next demand or accusation or explanation. There wasn't one. My mother didn't reach out. Marcus didn't either. Elaine disappeared again this time, without the tension that used to follow her silence. The absence felt intentional now, not punitive. They were recalibrating their lives without the leverage they once assumed they had. And I was doing the same. I took time off work. Not a vacation, just time. Mornings without alarms. Long walks through neighborhoods I'd never bothered to explore before. Coffee shops where no one knew my last name or my family history. I realized how much of my energy had been spent managing other people's expectations of me, anticipating reactions, softening truths, editing myself down to something easier to digest. Without that constant negotiation, my thoughts moved differently, slower, clearer. I went back to Ruth's office one afternoon to finalize a few loose ends. We reviewed documents, confirmed filings, closed folders that had grown thick with correspondence. As we wrapped up, she leaned back in her chair and studied me. "You're quieter," she said. "I think I always was," I replied. "I just stopped translating." She smiled. "That tends to happen when people stop asking for permission." On the drive home, I thought about that. Permission had been the unspoken currency in my family. Permission to speak, permission to want, permission to disagree without consequences. I had lived as if it was something that could be granted or revoked by others. Now I understood it differently. Permission isn't given, it's claimed. The first real test of that understanding came unexpectedly. My mother emailed me 2 weeks after the settlement. Not a long message, not defensive, not apologetic. Just a few lines. "I hope you're well. Things have been quiet here. Let me know if you'd like to talk sometime." I read it once, then again. Old instincts stirred. The urge to respond quickly, to reassure, to smooth, to prove I wasn't heartless. I set the phone down and didn't answer. Not because I was angry. Because I wasn't ready to reopen a door just because someone knocked more politely this time. A few days later, Marcus called. I answered. "How are you?" he asked. "I'm good," I said, and meant it. There was a pause. "Mom's struggling." I waited. "She didn't expect this to change things so much," he continued. I almost smiled. Change always feels dramatic when you're the one who benefited from the old arrangement. "I'm sorry she's struggling," I said. "I'm not responsible for fixing that." "I know," he replied. "I just thought you should know." We talked a little longer. About nothing important. Work, weather, neutral ground. Before we hung up, he said something that stayed with me. "I didn't realize how much we relied on you not pushing back." Neither had I, not fully. That night, I opened a notebook and started writing things down. Not evidence, not timelines, just observations. Mom equated love with control. Marcus equated peace with avoidance. I equated silence with maturity. Seeing it written like that stripped it of emotion. Patterns look smaller once they're named. I also started making decisions that would have once required a family meeting. I changed beneficiaries on my accounts, updated my emergency contacts, drafted my own will simple and clear without assumptions or placeholders. Each action felt quietly radical. I wasn't doing it to exclude anyone. I was doing it to make sure inclusion was intentional. One afternoon, I drove past Laurel Ridge without stopping. The house looked unchanged from the road. Porch still wide. Trees still framing the driveway. A place heavy with memory. For years, I had believed that house represented belonging. Now I saw it differently. Belonging doesn't come from access to a place or a name on a document. It comes from being considered without having to ask. The house could never give me that. Later that week, a cousin invited me to lunch. Someone who had stayed neutral throughout everything. We talked easily without tension. At one point, she said I didn't know what to believe for a while. "That's fair," I replied. "But I know this," she continued. "You look lighter." I thought about that on the drive home. Lighter didn't mean happy all the time, or healed, or untouched by what had happened. It meant unburdened. There's a difference. As spring edged toward summer, I felt myself moving forward in ways that didn't announce themselves. I said no without explanation. I left conversations when they turned dismissive. I stopped justifying my boundaries to people who hadn't earned insight into them. And the world didn't collapse. In fact, it adjusted. That realization carried more power than any legal victory, because it proved something I had never allowed myself to test before. I didn't need to be agreeable to be safe. I didn't need to be quiet to be loved. And I didn't need to be included in a family system that required my erasure to function. The settlement closed a chapter. But this part of my life wasn't about closure. It was about authorship. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to a story written by someone else. I was writing my own. And I wasn't rushing the ending. Power doesn't arrive the way I thought it would. It doesn't slam doors or raise voices or announce itself with vindication. It settles in quietly like a muscle you didn't know you were allowed to use until you finally stop compensating for everyone else's weakness. The weeks after the settlement were ordinary in ways that felt almost unfamiliar. I woke up. I went to work. I cooked dinner. I slept. Nothing demanded my loyalty. No one tested my availability. No emotional emergencies landed in my lap disguised as love. And that absence did something to me. I began to notice how much of my life had been shaped around preemptive sacrifice. I used to decide things based on how much disruption they would cause, not whether they were right for me, where I lived, how far I traveled, how visible my ambition was allowed to be. I had never called it fear. I had called it consideration. At work, the change showed up before I consciously made it. In meetings, I stopped cushioning my opinions with apologies. I didn't soften my language to keep others comfortable. When I disagreed, I said so plainly and moved on. No one punished me for it. In fact, people listened. My manager asked me one afternoon if I'd be interested in leading a new initiative. More responsibility, more visibility, a step I would have talked myself out of before. I want to think about it, I said. Not because I was unsure, because I finally understood that saying yes didn't require proving anything to anyone else first. That evening, my mother emailed again. This time the message was longer, careful, reflective. She wrote about how much had changed, how difficult the past months had been, how she hoped eventually we could find a way back to each other. She didn't mention the house, or the will, or the decisions she had made without me. She framed everything as mutual hurt. I stared at the screen for a long time, then I closed the laptop. I didn't respond. Not out of cruelty, out of clarity. There are conversations that only exist to restore access, not understanding. I had learned to tell the difference. Marcus called a few days later. He sounded tired. "She's asking me about you," he said. "A lot." I waited. "She doesn't know how to be in this without you," he continued. I let out a slow breath. "That's not my role anymore." "I know," he said. I didn't realize how much you held together." Neither had I. That night, I went for a long walk through my neighborhood. The air was warm. Windows were open. I passed homes where families were eating dinner, arguing gently, laughing, living without managing narratives. I wondered how many women inside those houses were quietly absorbing more than their share, calling it love, because it sounded nicer than control. The thought didn't make me bitter. It made me resolute. The next step I took wasn't legal. It was logistical. I changed my phone settings. Certain numbers went straight to voicemail. Not blocked, just filtered. I needed to decide when and how I engaged, not react out of habit. I also changed my emergency contacts. That decision lingered longer than I expected. It felt heavier than signing legal documents, because it acknowledged something I hadn't said out loud yet. I couldn't rely on my mother in moments that required neutrality, and that wasn't something I could fix by trying harder. I met with a financial planner shortly after. Not because I suddenly had wealth, but because I wanted my choices to be deliberate, not inherited. As we talked through goals and timelines, she asked if I expected family involvement in any of my decisions. "No," I said, "I don't." She nodded like that made perfect sense. And maybe it did. One weekend I returned to Laurel Ridge with Ruth, just briefly, to review a few details related to the trust. Standing there with a legal professional instead of family felt surreal. The house looked the same, but the weight of it had changed. "This place has history," Ruth said. "Yes," I replied, "but it doesn't get to dictate my future." She smiled. "That's the healthiest relationship anyone can have with an inheritance." I left feeling lighter than I had the first time. Not because I had claimed something, because I had released it. The final confrontation, when it came, was almost anticlimactic. My mother showed up at my apartment one evening without calling ahead. She stood outside, composed, holding herself together with practiced restraint. "I just want to talk," she said. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. We stood on the sidewalk, two women who shared a history but no longer shared authority. "You've shut me out," she said. "I've stepped back," I replied. "That's not the same," she insisted. "It is when the relationship depends on me staying small," I said. She looked at me, really looked, for the first time in months. "You think I controlled you," she said. "I know you did," I replied, "even when you called it care." Her eyes filled, but I didn't move. "I don't know how to be your mother like this," she whispered. "I'm not asking you to be," I said. "I'm asking you to see me as separate." She shook her head slowly. "Families don't work that way." "Healthy ones do," I replied. She left shortly after. No shouting, no accusations, just the quiet acknowledgement that something fundamental had shifted beyond her reach. That night, I sat alone in my apartment and felt something settle fully into place. I wasn't waiting anymore. Not for approval, not for understanding, not for an apology that would never come in the form I needed. I had crossed a threshold where my life no longer revolved around managing someone else's emotions. That was power, not dominance, not revenge, freedom. And it didn't need witnesses. Distance has a way of revealing what closeness used to hide. By the time autumn arrived, the space between my family and me had settled into something stable. Not peaceful in a sentimental way, just real, predictable. No sudden surges of guilt or obligation. No late-night calls wrapped in urgency. No need to decode silences. What surprised me most was how quickly my nervous system adjusted. I slept better. Not longer, just deeper. I stopped waking up with a vague sense that I had forgotten something important, some emotional task I was supposed to complete for someone else. My body no longer felt like it was waiting for permission to relax. That was new. My mother didn't disappear completely. She circled at a distance. Occasional emails, holiday-adjacent messages that acknowledged dates without inviting connection. Each one was careful, restrained, as if she were testing whether the old doors were still unlocked. They weren't. I answered some, briefly, kindly, without opening anything back up. That balance took practice. I had to learn the difference between politeness and availability, between compassion and access. For most of my life, those lines had been deliberately blurred. Marcus and I spoke more often than I expected, not deeply, not emotionally, but honestly, in a stripped-down way that didn't ask either of us to perform roles we no longer fit. One evening, he admitted something I hadn't anticipated. "I used to think you were just easier," he said. "Less demanding, less complicated." I didn't interrupt. "I see now that you were carrying the complexity so the rest of us didn't have to," he continued. "That's not insight," I said gently. "That's responsibility arriving late." He didn't argue. The wedding he and Elaine had postponed finally happened that fall. I wasn't invited. I found out through a mutual acquaintance who mentioned it casually, unaware of the history. I didn't feel hurt. That was the strangest part. The absence of an invitation felt like confirmation rather than rejection. It told me exactly where I stood without ambiguity or negotiation. And I preferred that. On the day of the wedding, I took a drive instead. No destination, just movement. I ended up near a state park and walked a trail I'd never noticed before, even though it was only a few miles from where I lived. Halfway through, I stopped at a clearing and sat on a rock, listening to the wind move through the trees. I thought about the version of myself who would have gone anyway, smiled politely, made herself small to fit a narrative that no longer matched reality, told herself that showing up was proof of maturity. That version of me felt very far away. When I got home, there was an email from my mother waiting in my inbox. It was longer than the others. She wrote about the wedding, about how strange it felt without me there, about how families change whether we want them to or not. She said she hoped I understood that she had always done what she believed was right. She didn't ask a question. She didn't apologize. She didn't acknowledge the harm. I read it once, then I archived it. Not because it didn't matter, because it no longer required a response. The real shift happened a few weeks later in a moment so ordinary it almost passed unnoticed. I was at work reviewing a contract when my manager asked if I could stay late to help resolve an issue that wasn't technically my responsibility. Old instinct kicked in immediately. The reflex to say yes, to prove reliability, to be the solution. I paused. "I can't tonight," I said, "but I can look at it first thing tomorrow." He nodded. "That works." No follow-up, no disappointment, no consequences. I sat back in my chair and felt something click. I had spent years believing that saying no required justification, that boundaries needed explanation, that refusal had to be softened with apologies to remain acceptable. None of that was true. That evening, I went home and wrote something down in my notebook. Boundaries are not ultimatums, they are information. I carried that thought with me through the rest of the year. Thanksgiving came and went. I spent it with friends cooking together, laughing without subtext. When someone asked about my family, I answered simply, "We're not close right now." No one pressed. Christmas arrived quietly. I received a card from my mother. Just a card. No letter inside. No attempt to reopen anything. I placed it on the shelf and left it there. I wasn't punishing her. I was pacing myself. One afternoon in early winter, Ruth called to check in. "Are you doing all right?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "Better than all right." She smiled through the phone. "You know, most people think legal victories are the hard part." "And they're not," I said. "No," she agreed. "Living with clarity is harder, but it lasts longer." After the call, I thought about everything that had changed since that day in my mother's kitchen. How small the moment had seemed at first. How quickly it had unraveled a lifetime of unspoken rules. The hardest part hadn't been standing up to my family. It had been letting go of the belief that if I just tried harder, they would choose me differently. That belief had kept me compliant, hopeful, quiet. Letting it go had felt like failure at first. Now it felt like truth. I no longer wondered what would happen if I disappointed them. I had already done that. And the world had not ended. Instead, it had widened. The silence that once felt like punishment now felt like protection. I had learned when to speak. More importantly, I had learned when not to. And in that space, I finally heard myself clearly. The last thing that changed was my understanding of love. Not all at once. Not dramatically. It arrived the way most permanent things do, slowly after the noise has faded and there is finally room to think. It happened on an ordinary morning. I was making coffee before work, standing barefoot in my kitchen, watching steam rise from the kettle. No messages waiting. No tension humming under my skin. No sense that I was late for something emotional I hadn't agreed to attend. And I realized something that stopped me cold. I was no longer afraid of being misunderstood. For most of my life, that fear had guided everything. I explained myself too much. I softened my edges. I accepted less so others wouldn't feel accused by my needs. I believed that if I could just be clear enough, kind enough, patient enough, love would eventually become safe. What I finally understood was this: love that requires you to disappear is not love you can make safer by shrinking. It is control that improves when you comply. The months after the settlement passed without incident. No legal surprises, no dramatic reconciliations. My mother maintained her careful distance. Marcus kept our relationship polite and limited. Elaine stayed out of my orbit entirely. The family narrative settled into something stable enough for everyone else to live with, and I stopped caring what version of the story they told. That was the real revenge, if anyone insists on calling it that. Not humiliation, not loss, not watching anyone struggle. It was refusing to participate in a system that only functioned when I doubted myself. I noticed the difference in small, unglamorous ways. I made decisions without checking in first. I planned my time based on energy instead of obligation. I stopped bracing for holidays, birthdays, and milestones that used to come with emotional invoices attached. When my phone rang, I answered because I wanted to, not because I felt summoned. That kind of freedom doesn't announce itself. It simply becomes normal. One evening, I drove past Laurel Ridge again. This time, I didn't slow down. The house no longer pulled at me. It no longer represented belonging, fairness, or loss. It was just a house. The meaning had drained out of it once I stopped using it to measure my worth. Later that week, I ran into my grandmother's old neighbor at the post office. She recognized me immediately. "You know," she said, "your grandmother always worried about you being taken for granted." I smiled softly. She was right. "She would be proud of you," the woman added. For the first time, I believed that without needing proof. The truth is, standing up for myself didn't make me stronger overnight. It didn't fix my family. It didn't turn me into someone fearless or invulnerable. What it did was give me my choices back. And once you have that, everything else reorganizes itself around it. I didn't need my mother to admit what she'd done for me to know it mattered. I didn't need Marcus to apologize for benefiting from silence. I didn't need Elaine to understand me. I needed to stop negotiating my dignity for conditional acceptance. That was the turning point. If you're listening to this story and something in it feels uncomfortably familiar, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not difficult for asking to be included. You are not selfish for questioning arrangements that only work when you stay quiet. You are not breaking a family by refusing to be its pressure valve. Generosity without boundaries is not kindness. Loyalty without consent is not virtue. And love that punishes you for autonomy is not love worth preserving. I didn't win by taking anything away from my family. I won by taking myself out of a role that required my silence to survive. By choosing clarity over comfort, dignity over approval, self-respect over being easy to manage. That choice didn't make my life louder. It made it honest. If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments. Someone else might be sitting in silence right now, wondering if they're allowed to step back, draw a line, or choose themselves. You are. And if you want to hear more stories like this told without guilt or gloss, stay here. Like, subscribe. And remember this: peace doesn't come from being needed, it comes from being free.